She bought the mansion on a Tuesday. By Friday, she was standing in his driveway with a plate of brownies and a golden retriever that had somehow escaped a fence worth more than his truck. Logan Carter hadn't asked for any of it. He was 32 years old, raising an 8-year-old daughter on his own, running a construction business on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee. His life was calluses and early mornings and making sure Lily had a hot breakfast before school. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It was his. Then Victoria Sinclair moved in next door, and ordinary stopped being an option. If you're watching this story unfold and it already has your attention, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens between a hardworking single dad and a billionaire who refuses to take no for an answer is the kind of story you won't want to walk away from. The morning Victoria Sinclair's moving trucks arrived on Briarwood Lane, Logan Carter was on his roof. Not metaphorically, literally on his roof, crouched over a section of flashing that had been leaking since the last heavy rain, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and a pair of work boots that had seen better years. He had a caulk gun in one hand, a cup of coffee balanced on the flat section near the chimney, and his daughter Lily standing in the driveway below him, asking questions at a rate that would exhaust a schoolteacher. "Dad, Dad, can I have a dog?" "We talked about that, Lily. We talked about it, but you never said no." "I said maybe, which means not yet, which means we're not talking about it right now. But Cassidy at school has a dog and she says," "Lily, what?" "I love you very much. Please let me not fall off the roof." She went quiet for approximately 45 seconds. He counted. "If I saved up my allowance, could I—" "Lily, okay, I'm going inside." She didn't go inside. She sat on the front porch steps and opened a book, which was her way of staying nearby without technically disobeying him. Logan had raised her to find loopholes, apparently. He wasn't sure whether to be frustrated or proud. He pressed the caulk into the seam along the flashing, smoothed it with his thumb, and let himself breathe for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet on weekday mornings. Most people were already gone by 8. Commutes into Charlotte, school drop-offs, the steady machinery of suburban routine. Briarwood Lane was one of those streets that still had mature oak trees and actual sidewalks and neighbors who waved to each other, which was rarer than it should have been. Logan had bought the house 7 years ago with his wife Dana, when it needed more work than either of them had fully understood. He'd fixed nearly all of it himself, one project at a time, over the years that followed. The years that followed. That was how he thought about it. Before and after. There was the before, which was Dana and laughter, and a future they'd mapped out together on the back of a pizza box one evening, half drunk on cheap wine. And then there was the after, which was him and Lily and the house and the work and figuring out, slowly and without much grace, how to keep going. He was still figuring it out. He noticed the trucks when the first one turned off Kensington Avenue and rumbled down the lane. An enormous white moving truck followed by a second one, followed by what appeared to be a flatbed carrying wrapped furniture so expensive-looking that even the protective blanket seemed unnecessary. He watched from the roof as they made the slow turn into the driveway of the Hargrove property, the stone mansion at the end of the lane that had sat empty for the better part of 8 months. The Hargrove place was not a modest home. It sat behind an iron gate on nearly 2 acres, a 3-story colonial with a circular driveway, a pool that Logan had glimpsed through the fence once, and a guest cottage that was larger than the average starter home. Old Man Hargrove had passed away the previous winter, and his family had moved the estate through probate faster than anyone expected. There had been rumors about who bought it. A professional athlete, someone said, at the hardware store. A tech executive relocating from San Francisco, someone else offered. Logan hadn't paid much attention. Whoever they were, they could afford their own contractor. He finished the section of flashing and was working his way back toward the ladder when he noticed the car. It pulled in behind the moving trucks. A black Range Rover, current model, no visible plates yet, and parked with the casual confidence of someone who is accustomed to arriving places and having things arranged around them. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Logan was far enough away that he shouldn't have registered much. But something about the way she moved caught his attention the way a sharp sound does. Not loud, but precise. She was tall, dark-haired, wearing a camel-colored coat over what looked like dark slacks, and she stood in the driveway of the Hargrove mansion, looking at it the way people look at things they actually own, rather than things they're visiting. Not reverence. Assessment. She pulled out a phone, spoke into it briefly, gestured toward the truck drivers with the familiarity of someone who gave direction naturally, and then did something unexpected. She turned and looked down the lane. Logan was on a rooftop. He had no particular reason to feel caught. But for a half second, before he looked back down at his caulk gun, he had the strange sensation that she'd seen him anyway. He didn't think about the neighbor again for the rest of the week. He had a 4-day commercial job in Concord that needed his full crew, a subcontractor dispute over framing materials, and a school fundraiser on Thursday that Lily had circled on the refrigerator calendar in red marker 3 weeks ago. Carter Construction was a 7-man operation, 8 if he counted himself, which he usually didn't until something went wrong, and keeping it solvent required the kind of attention that left very little room for peripheral thoughts. His days followed the same basic architecture they always had. Up at 5:30, coffee and a sandwich he'd prepped the night before, check in with his site foreman Marcus by 6, drop Lily at school by 7:45, job site by 8, pick Lily up at 3:15 unless her Aunt Renee, Dana's younger sister, was available. Dinner, homework, stories. If he wasn't too tired, which he usually was, which meant he read anyway because Lily noticed the nights he skipped. Dishes, paperwork, sleep. It was a tight loop. Not unhappy exactly, but tight. On Saturday morning, he was in the driveway washing the work truck when he heard the gate at the end of the lane creak open and turned to see the golden retriever. It was a large dog, well-fed, wearing a collar that probably cost more than Logan's power washer. It came trotting up the sidewalk with the self-possessed energy of an animal that had never been told no in its life, paused at the foot of Logan's driveway, sniffed the air with tremendous seriousness, and then walked straight across the wet concrete toward him. "Hey," Logan held out a hand. "Hey, whoa, easy." The dog licked his palm, decided they were now friends, and sat on his foot. Lily appeared in the doorway behind him at a velocity that suggested she'd been watching through the window for exactly this kind of opportunity. Dad, there's a dog on your foot." "I'm aware. Can we keep it?" "It has a collar, Lily. Can we keep it until its owner comes?" "That's just called having a dog temporarily." "That's still having a dog, though." Logan crouched down and checked the collar. There was a tag, Biscuit, and a phone number. He was reaching for his phone when he heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up. She was in running clothes this time. Dark leggings, a half-zip pullover, hair pulled back. She looked like she'd been on a real run, not a performative neighborhood walk, which he noted without deciding what to do with the information. She slowed when she reached the end of his driveway, and he stood up. "That yours?" he asked. "That's Biscuit, yes." She looked at the dog with a specific brand of exasperation that suggested this was not the first unauthorized excursion. "He's a flight risk. I thought I'd fix the section by the side gate." She looked at Logan. "I'm sorry if he bothered you." "He didn't. He sat on my foot." A corner of her mouth moved. "That's how he claims territory. You should feel honored." Lily had materialized next to Logan at some point in the last 15 seconds and was now looking at the woman with the open assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise her curiosity. "Is he really yours?" she asked. "He really is. His full name is Biscuit Alexander Sinclair, which is his own fault for chewing my passport when he was a puppy." Lily laughed. The real one, not the polite one. Logan kept his expression neutral. "I'm Victoria," the woman said, extending her hand to Logan. "I just moved in at the end of the lane." "Logan Carter." He shook it. Her grip was direct. "This is my daughter Lily." "Hi," Lily said. "Hi." Victoria crouched down to leash the dog, who submitted with theatrical reluctance. "I'll fix the gate today. Again." She stood. "I really am sorry." "It's fine," Logan said. "He's a good dog." "He's a menace," she said, but she scratched behind his ears when she said it. "But he has his moments." She looked at Logan once more, not lingering, just a beat. "It's nice to meet you, Logan Carter. I have a feeling we'll run into each other." She said it lightly, like a simple, neighborly thing to say. Logan nodded and went back to his truck. And the only reason he was still thinking about it 4 hours later was that she'd been right. Briarwood Lane was not a long street. The next Friday, there were brownies on his porch. Not a note with a phone number, not a formal introduction, not anything that asked for anything. Just a plate wrapped in clear cellophane with a small card that said, "Welcome to having me as a neighbor." V in handwriting that was confident to the point of being almost illegible. He brought them inside. Lily ate 2 before he could establish any kind of ground rules about dessert before dinner. They were genuinely excellent brownies, which he found mildly aggravating for reasons he didn't examine. "Who made these?" Lily asked. "The new neighbor. The lady with biscuit?" "Yeah." Lily considered this. "She's nice," she announced, as if delivering a verdict. She took a third brownie. Logan let her. He wrapped the plate back up and set it on the counter and told himself he'd return it next time he had a reason to walk to the end of the lane. Then he went out to the garage to finish a bid estimate, and if he thought about the handwriting on the card for longer than was strictly necessary, he kept that to himself. He didn't go to the end of the lane. She came to him. The following Tuesday, Logan was working in the backyard, replacing a section of fence posts that had rotted out at the base, when he heard her voice coming from the front of the house. "Just a quick question, I promise, and then I'll leave you alone." He came around the side of the house to find Victoria on the front porch, holding a cup of coffee. Her own coffee, in a travel mug, which he appreciated because it signaled she wasn't planning a long visit. Talking to Lily, who had answered the door without telling him anyone was at the door. "Lily," he said. "She wanted to ask you something," Lily reported. "I can come back," Victoria said, and she clearly meant it. That was the thing that kept catching him off balance. She would offer to leave in a way that sounded genuine rather than performative. "I was walking by and I had a question, but it can wait." "It's fine," Logan said. "What's the question?" She held up her coffee mug. "Do you know a good hardware store? I've been to 2 and I can't find the specific bolt size I need for the gate hardware. I keep getting sent in circles." He almost laughed. He managed not to. "What size?" "M8, 40 millimeters. "That's not going to be at a general hardware store. You need a fastener supply shop." He named the place on the edge of Concord he used for commercial jobs. "Ask for Eddie. Tell him you need metric hex head. He'll have it." "Eddie?" she repeated. "Got it." She looked at him like she was deciding whether to say something. "Thank you." "Sure." She turned to go, then looked back at Lily. "What's your name? I forgot to ask last time." "Lily Carter?" "Lily Carter," Victoria said, as though filing it carefully. "That's a good name. Does your dad let you eat cookies for breakfast?" "No," Lily said sadly. "He sounds strict." "He's okay," Lily said, with the diplomatic generosity of a child who has learned that adults hear everything. Victoria smiled, a real one, quick and unguarded, before she put the travel mug back to her lips. She looked at Logan once over the rim, said, "Thank you, Logan Carter," and walked back down the front path. Biscuit was waiting at the sidewalk, apparently having been instructed to stay. Lily looked up at her father. "I like her," she said. Logan went back to the fence post and didn't say anything at all. The thing was, and he was honest enough to admit this to himself in the private accounting he kept, she wasn't what he'd expected. He'd heard the rumors before he ever spoke to her. His foreman Marcus had looked her up after Logan mentioned the mansion at the end of the lane had sold. Victoria Sinclair, 30 years old, founder and CEO of Sinclair Ventures, a holding company with fingers in commercial real estate, sustainable tech, and a hospitality brand that apparently had boutique hotels in 6 cities. She'd built it largely herself, starting just after college, and had been featured in business publications and on financial segments often enough that her name carried a specific ambient familiarity Logan recognized without being able to attach it to anything concrete. The point was, she was not a person who needed to be in a quiet Charlotte suburb. She owned property in New York, Austin, and according to Marcus, who had done more research than Logan had asked for, somewhere in Portugal. Briarwood Lane was not an obvious choice. He didn't ask her about it. It wasn't his business. But she kept appearing, not intrusively. She never knocked without a reason, never manufactured excuses that were fully transparent. But she had a talent for existing in the same spaces as Logan at times when conversation was natural and departure would have been strange. He saw her at the end of the lane when he was getting the mail. She was at the same coffee counter at the shop on Garrison Street when he stopped one morning before a job. She appeared at the edge of the parking lot during school pickup 3 consecutive Fridays because, as she mentioned in passing, she'd been talking with the school principal about a potential donation to their arts program. He didn't know what to do with that information, so he did nothing with it. What he noticed, and what he would not have admitted to anyone, including Renee, who watched him with the specific knowing patience of a woman who had decided not to say anything yet, was that Victoria was funny, not in a performed way, in a dry, often self-deprecating way that came out in moments she probably didn't calculate. She had told him, completely without fanfare, that she had once accidentally bid on and purchased 17 acres of swampland in Louisiana because she'd gotten on a call before reading the details. She had described her college apartment, before the money, during the years she was building the first iteration of what would become her company, with a specificity and warmth that made it clear she hadn't forgotten where she'd come from. She asked questions and then listened to the answers. This was rarer than it should have been. She also watched him with Lily in a way he'd noticed exactly once, and then decided not to think about again, because thinking about it felt like stepping towards something he hadn't cleared space for. The fundraiser for Lily's school came on a Thursday evening in early October. It was a straightforward affair, the kind of neighborhood event that required a sign-up sheet, folding tables, and 3 different parents arguing about the correct placement of the dessert station. Logan had volunteered to help set up because Lily had asked him to, and also because he was genuinely incapable of showing up somewhere and not offering to carry something. He was unloading folding tables from the back of a borrowed trailer when he heard Lily's voice rise in excitement across the parking lot. "Victoria, you came!" He turned. Victoria was crossing the lot in a jacket and boots, hair down, holding a tray of something that looked like she'd actually made it rather than bought it, which he was starting to recognize as a pattern. She reached Lily and crouched to say something to her, whatever it was making Lily laugh and reach out to grab her hand and drag her toward the display tables. Logan set down the table he was holding. Renee appeared beside him with all the subtlety of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "So that's the neighbor," Renee said. "Don't." "I didn't say anything." "You're about to." "I'm just noting that she drove to a school fundraiser for a child who is not her own, made something from scratch, and is currently being pulled around by your daughter like she's known her for years." Renee paused. "That's all I'm noting." "Renee." "Logan." "I'm going to set up these tables." "You do that." He set up the tables. Victoria ended up helping at the dessert station, which had, of course, been rearranged into the correct position. And for 2 hours, Logan watched her navigate the crowded community room with an ease that he recognized as someone who had learned to be comfortable in any room, regardless of its size or prestige. She talked to the PTA parents the same way she talked to the groundskeeper who'd showed up to help break down afterward. She was patient with the children who were too shy to speak and direct with the ones who weren't. She didn't check her phone. At the end of the evening, Logan found her helping stack the folding chairs, without being asked, in a camel-colored jacket that had no business being near a stack of metal furniture. "You're going to get that dirty," he said. "I have other jackets." She stacked another chair without looking at him. "This was a good event." "Yeah, Lily's school does well with these. The kids from the Mooresville Exchange, are they here for the full week?" "Just Wednesday through Friday." She stacked the last chair and turned to face him. They were close enough that he was aware of it in the specific way he'd been trying to avoid being aware of things. "Your daughter is exceptional, Logan." "I know," he said, because he did. "She told me about her mom," Victoria said. "Not gently, exactly. She wasn't a woman who handled things the way you handle glass, which he'd noticed, just directly. You don't have to say anything about that. I just wanted you to know she talked about her. She's clearly not afraid of it." Logan looked at the stack of chairs for a moment. "I worked hard to make sure she wasn't." "I know you did." A pause. "It shows." He didn't know what to say to that. He picked up the stack of chairs and carried them to the storage room. And when he came back, she'd already moved on to help wrangle the stray name tags no one had collected. The moment passed the way moments do. without fanfare, without resolution. But he drove home that night with it still sitting somewhere in his chest, not quite gone. Lily fell asleep in the car. He carried her inside and got her shoes off and covered her without waking her, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark, the way he always did. "You're doing okay," Dana had told him toward the end, when she was still finding moments of clarity in the fog the illness had made of things. "You're gonna do okay." He hadn't believed her at the time. He'd thought she was saying it to comfort him. He was starting to think she'd known something he didn't. Isut. 3 weeks later, Logan's truck broke down. Not dramatically. Not on the highway in the rain, which was the scenario he'd been dreading. Just quietly, in his own driveway, on a Monday morning at 6:45 when he needed to be at a site in 15 minutes. The starter motor, which he'd been meaning to address for 2 months, had finally made its feelings known. He stood in the driveway with his coffee and his phone and went through the options in his head. Marcus could come, but Marcus was already at the site. Renee had an early meeting. He could call the crew's second truck, but it was loaded with materials on a job in Concord. He was still running the numbers when the black Range Rover came slowly down the lane and stopped. The window came down. "Starter?" Victoria asked. He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "It made that specific clicking noise yesterday. I noticed." She looked back at the road, then at him. "Where do you need to be?" "I can call Logan." She looked at him with the patient precision of someone who had run out of interest in watching people create problems for themselves. "Where do you need to be?" He was at the site by 7:05. Victoria dropped him at the gate, said nothing in particular when he thanked her, and drove away before he could complicate it. He watched the taillights for a second longer than he needed to. Marcus came around the corner of the building with a clipboard and took in Logan's expression. "What?" Marcus said. "Nothing," Logan said. "You're standing in the parking lot looking like a man who just got given something he doesn't know how to hold." "Can we talk about the framing inspection?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Sure," he said. "Sure, we can talk about the framing inspection." They walked inside. The evenings were getting shorter. By 5:30, the light was already going amber at the edges, and the oak trees on Briarwood Lane were starting to let go of their leaves in small, reluctant shifts. Logan liked October for reasons he'd never articulated well. Something about the honest quality of the light, or the way the neighborhood seemed to settle into itself. He was on the front porch with a beer and the day's remaining paperwork when Victoria walked past with Biscuit. This was a nightly thing now. He'd noticed the pattern without commenting on it. She walked at the same time, same route, dog on the leash, phone in her pocket instead of in her hand. She always slowed slightly when she reached his house. Tonight she stopped. "Can I ask you something?" she said from the sidewalk. "Sure." "Why construction?" He looked at her. It was not the question he'd expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she gestured vaguely, "you're smart. You could have done other things. Why construction?" He thought about it honestly rather than giving her the practiced answer. "My dad built houses," he said. "He wasn't a contractor. He built things on the weekends, stuff around the house. Took me with him on job sites when I was a kid, sometimes, when he knew guys who needed extra hands." He looked at the beer in his hand. "There's something about it. You build something and it stands there. It doesn't go away. People live in it." He paused. "I like that." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Biscuit sat at her feet. "I started my company in a studio apartment with a laptop and $900, she said. "People always assumed there was something glamorous about it." She tilted her head slightly. "There wasn't. It was terrifying. I made 100 mistakes in the first year." "What kept you going?" "Being too stubborn to stop." She said it without any performance behind it, just the plain fact of it. Then she looked at him with something he'd been watching accumulate in her expression over the past month, something she hadn't named. "You're not afraid of hard things," she said. "I find that—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at Biscuit, then back at him. "I find that rare," she finished. It was not, he suspected, the word she'd started with. He nodded. She stood there a moment longer than leaving required, and then she said goodnight and walked on, and Biscuit looked back once over his shoulder before following. Logan sat on the porch and finished his beer and let the October dark settle around him, and felt the particular low pull of something he hadn't felt in a long time, like a tide he'd convinced himself had stopped. It hadn't stopped. It had just been waiting for the right conditions. He sat with that for a while, in the honest dark, not running toward it and not running away. He wasn't sure yet which direction he was going to choose. On a Friday morning 2 weeks later, Logan got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Friday was a job site day, no time for vendor calls, but something made him pick up on the third ring. "Logan Carter?" A man's voice, clipped, well-rehearsed. "I'm calling on behalf of Meridian Property Holdings. We're interested in discussing a potential partnership with Carter Construction, specifically regarding the Kensington Avenue commercial development." Logan sat in the parking lot of the site and listened. The Kensington Avenue project was the largest commercial development within 30 miles, a mixed-use complex that would take 3 to 4 years to build and anchor 3 blocks of the new district. Logan had looked at the public bid documents twice and decided Carter Construction wasn't quite the right scale for it yet. Not yet. Maybe in 2 years. "How did you get my name?" Logan asked. A pause. "A referral. I'm not able to say more than that at this stage." Logan wrote down the number, said he'd call back on Monday, and sat in the truck for a moment after hanging up. He thought about who might have made a referral of that scale. His network was good, but this was a different tier. He thought about it for exactly long enough to arrive at the most obvious answer. He didn't call her about it. He went in and ran his job site and made himself not think about it. But that evening, when she walked past with Biscuit, he watched her from the porch and felt something shift that hadn't shifted in a very long time. Not love. He was too careful with that word to use it for something this early and this uncertain, but the beginning of something that might grow into it if he was willing to stop standing in his own way. He wasn't ready to stop standing in his own way yet, but he was, for the first time in longer than he could measure, at least considering it. That was something. That was maybe more than something. On the street below, Biscuit pulled at the leash, trying to drag Victoria toward Logan's driveway the way he always did, and she let him pull a little, just enough, before gently correcting course. Logan watched her go, and the porch light came on behind him, and somewhere inside the house Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table, and the radio was playing something low and unhurried. The lane was quiet. The oaks were letting go of the last of their leaves. And Logan Carter sat in the orange October light and thought about what it might mean, what it might actually cost him, and what it might be worth to let someone in. He called Meridian back on Monday. The man on the phone, his name turned out to be Gerald Foss, a project manager with the kind of title that existed specifically to keep principals at a remove, was careful about the referral in the way that people are careful when they've been told to be careful. Logan asked twice, got nothing useful either time. He let it go and focused on the actual conversation, which was about preliminary interest, about capacity assessments, about whether Carter Construction could handle a subcontract role on the Kensington Avenue development that could run 18 months of steady work. Logan drove to the site that afternoon and sat in the truck and did the math. Not the optimistic math, the real math, the kind that accounted for payroll and equipment and insurance margins, and the fact that scaling quickly was one of the fastest ways to break something you'd spent years building carefully. He called Marcus on the way home. "Walk me through it," Marcus said. Logan walked him through it. There was a long pause. "That's a significant step up." "Yeah. It's also the kind of job that doesn't come around unless someone with pull pointed at you." "I know." Another pause. "You know who pointed." "I think so." Marcus let that sit for a moment. "Is that a problem?" Logan watched the road. "I don't know yet." He didn't bring it up with Victoria that week. He needed to think about it separately from her, to run it through his own judgment without the complication of owing her anything or resenting her for helping. He'd built Carter Construction from nothing, from a used truck and a borrowed nail gun and a reputation that grew one completed job at a time. He hadn't taken shortcuts and he hadn't taken favors. That wasn't stubbornness. It was the only way he knew how to look at his own work and trust it. But she hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that too. If she'd mentioned his name to someone, and he didn't know for certain that she had, It wasn't a manipulation. It was the kind of thing people with wide networks did naturally, connecting names they trusted to opportunities that fit. It was just that Logan had never been the name someone like that connected to anything before. He sat with the discomfort of that for a few days until it settled into something he could actually examine, and then he called Meridian back and said he wanted to see the full project scope before making any decisions. Gerald Foss sent the documents over within the hour. Logan stayed up until 1 in the morning reading them. What? Lily started asking about Victoria with a frequency that made it impossible to pretend the conversations weren't happening. It wasn't pointed. Lily was 8, not 16, and her interest was genuine rather than strategic. But she'd grown into the habit of asking where Victoria was, whether Biscuit had escaped again, whether Victoria might want to come to the school book fair, whether Victoria liked soccer because Lily's team had a game Saturday. The questions came the way Lily's questions always came, in bursts, without warning, usually while Logan was in the middle of something that required concentration. "I don't know if she likes soccer," Logan said on Thursday afternoon over homework. "You could ask her." "I could." "Why don't you?" "Lily." "What? You talked to her?" "I've talked to her a few times, yeah." "That's not a few times." Lily looked up from her worksheet with the expression of a child who has been quietly recording evidence. "She came to my school thing. She brought us brownies. You gave her a ride that one time." "She gave me a ride." "You gave her directions to the hardware store place." "That's not really—" "You talked on the porch for a long time Wednesday. I watched from my window." Logan set down the invoice he'd been reviewing. "You were supposed to be doing reading time." "I finished my book." "And instead of getting another one, you watched out the window." Lily had the grace to look slightly guilty, which meant she'd thought about her answer. "She laughs at your jokes," she said. "You're not that funny." Logan stared at his daughter for a long moment. She stared back with perfect calm. "Go get another book," he said. She went. But she was smiling when she turned away, and Logan looked at the ceiling and thought, not for the first time, that Lily was going to be a problem when she was older. The perceptive kind of problem. The kind you couldn't win arguments with. He went to Saturday's soccer game alone. Victoria was not there. He hadn't asked her, so that was logical. Still, he found himself looking once toward the sideline gap where she would have stood, if she'd been there, and then pointedly watching the game instead. Lily scored a goal and turned to find him in the crowd immediately, the way she always did, and he raised both arms and she grinned. Some things were enough on their own. He knew that. He just needed to keep remembering it. The brownie plate had been sitting on his kitchen counter for 3 weeks because he hadn't returned it. He noticed it one morning when he was making coffee, just sitting there, clean, waiting, and thought about how many times he'd picked it up with the intention of walking it to the end of the lane and then set it back down again. He was a grown man who could not return a plate. He was vaguely disgusted with himself. He picked it up, put it under his arm, and walked to the end of Briarwood Lane on a Saturday morning. The iron gate was open. The intercom panel on the pillar had a keypad and a camera, but the gate itself sat ajar, which he suspected was either deliberate or a side effect of Biscuit's ongoing infrastructure criticism. He came up the circular driveway and knocked on the front door. It took a while, long enough that he was considering leaving the plate on the mat and walking away, which would have defeated the purpose entirely. Then Victoria opened the door. She was wearing a paint-stained shirt, old jeans, and had a smear of what appeared to be sage green paint on her left forearm. Her hair was up in a loose, unsustainable arrangement. She looked like she'd been in the middle of something and had arrived at the door still processing the interruption. "Logan," she blinked. "Hi." "I'm returning your plate," he said. He held it up. She looked at it, then at him. "You walked down here on a Saturday morning to return a plate." "I've been meaning to." Something moved in her expression. Brief amusement, then something warmer and more controlled. "Come in," she said. "I'm in the middle of a disaster, but come in." The disaster was the front sitting room, which had been partially stripped to the plaster and was half-painted in 2 competing shades while swatches of paint in 5 other colors were taped to the wall at eye level. Drop cloths on the floor, a ladder in the corner, an open laptop on the windowsill playing something that was either jazz or a film score. Logan couldn't tell from the doorway. "Professional advice?" he said, setting the plate on the hallway table. If you're offering, he looked at the two competing colors on the wall. The lighter one. The darker one is fighting the window light. She turned and looked at the wall as though she was seeing it differently, and then nodded once with the decisiveness of someone who had been arguing with herself about it for hours. I knew it was the lighter one. I was trying to talk myself out of it. Why? Because I liked the darker one better when I bought it. She picked up her coffee from the windowsill. You want coffee? I'm okay. I'll make you coffee anyway. She was already walking toward the back of the house. He followed because it seemed stranger not to. The kitchen was the part of the house she'd clearly focused on first. It was finished, warm, the kind of room that had been thought about. Good countertops, open shelving, a farmhouse sink with the kind of hardware that was expensive without advertising itself. She moved around it comfortably, which meant she actually cooked in here, which matched the brownies and the fundraiser tray, and a handful of other details he'd filed away without meaning to. How's the gate? He asked. Fixed and rebroken. She poured without looking up. Biscuit is pathologically committed to the street. I think he was a golden retriever in a previous life who used to run free in a meadow, and he's grieving it. He's a golden retriever in this life. I know, it's very on brand. She turned and slid a mug across the counter to him. How's the truck? Fixed. Starter motor. Good. She leaned against the counter with her own cup. Did you call Meridian? There it was. He'd been waiting for it without acknowledging that he was waiting for it. He looked at his coffee. I did, he said. And? I'm still reviewing the scope. A pause. She was watching him with the careful, unhurried attention that was one of the things about her that he'd stopped trying to normalize. Are you going to ask me if I made a call? Did you? She didn't flinch. I had lunch with Thomas Aldrin in September. He mentioned the Kensington project. I mentioned your name and said you did excellent work and ran a tight operation. That's the extent of it. She held his gaze. I didn't make a promise on your behalf or imply anything I wasn't confident about. I just said your name to someone who needed a name. Logan turned the mug in his hands. The kitchen was quiet except for the distant sound of her laptop in the front room. I've been building this company since I was 24, he said. Every job I've gotten because I earned it. I know that. I need you to understand why that matters to me. I do understand it. She wasn't defensive. She just said it. I built mine the same way, mostly. The few times someone opened a door for me early on, it felt complicated. Like it changed the shape of something I wanted to be mine. She turned her cup once on the counter. I don't think I was wrong to mention your name to Thomas, but I get why it landed strangely. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. It landed fine, he said finally. I just needed to sort it out. And did you? Working on it. Something like a smile. Okay. She straightened. More coffee? I thought you already made me a cup I said I didn't want. I did. You're drinking it. He looked down. He was, in fact, most of the way through it. Yeah, he said. Okay, sure. She refilled it without ceremony, and they stood in the kitchen for another 20 minutes talking about the renovation, about the Kensington project's scope, about Lily's soccer league, about nothing in particular. He noticed, when he finally left, that 2.5 hours had passed since he'd walked up the driveway. He stood on the front steps for a moment and tried to account for the time, and couldn't. He walked back down Briarwood Lane in the mid-morning light, feeling like a man who had just stepped slightly closer to the edge of something without meaning to, and was not entirely sure he wanted to step back. November came in cold and fast, the way it did some years, and Renee had Lily for the weekend, which meant Logan had 48 hours of silence that he filled with work and project estimates and the particular quiet that always settled around him when the house was empty. He was fine with it. He'd made his peace with the empty house weekends years ago. He used them to catch up, to recalibrate, to do the things that were harder to do when he was also managing breakfast and homework and the rotating chaos of raising an 8-year-old. He was fine. He was standing in the kitchen at 9 on Saturday night, eating leftover pasta over the sink because there was no one to model proper table habits for, when his phone lit up with a text from a number that was now in his contacts under the straightforward label he'd given it, V. Sinclair. Power's out at the gate. The code panel is dead. The security company can't get here until morning. Can you recommend an electrician who works nights? He called Marcus's cousin Danny, who did exactly that kind of work. Then he thought about it for 30 seconds and texted back, calling someone. Also, is the main panel inside the house okay? Everything inside is fine, just the gate panel. It's starting to feel very haunted mansion. Stay inside. Danny will call you within the hour. Thank you. You didn't have to do that. He almost typed something and didn't. He put the phone face down on the counter, finished the pasta, and went back to his project files. Danny called him back at 10:15. The panel connection was corroded through. Easy fix, 40 minutes. Your neighbor was fine. She made coffee and asked good questions about the wiring. That sounds about right, Logan said. She tips well, too, Danny added. Danny. Just noting. Good night, Danny. He texted her. Problem solved. Corroded connection. Danny should have it running. He did. It's working. Thank you. I owe you. He started to type you don't owe me anything and stopped. Looked at the ceiling, put the phone down and went to bed. He did not immediately fall asleep, which was unusual for a man who averaged 4.5 hours a night. He lay in the dark and ran numbers in his head the way he usually did when he needed to quiet his brain. Project costs, material estimates, crew scheduling. It worked eventually. It always worked eventually. But not before a different kind of accounting had run through first. Not spreadsheets, just the honest inventory of where he was, who he'd become, and what the last 2 years had gradually, quietly cost him in ways that had nothing to do with the business. He told himself he was fine. He mostly was. But there is a difference between fine and whole. And lying in the dark of his own bedroom on a Saturday night, he was honest enough to recognize the gap. December moved through its motions. Holiday concerts and class parties, and Lily's elaborate campaign for specific presents that she telegraphed through a series of drawings she left casually around the house in high-traffic areas. Logan bought the art set and the basketball and 3 of the books and held firm against the request for a second dog, which had apparently been revived by a strategy refresh. Lily had written out a pro-con list and left it on the kitchen table with the cons column conspicuously thinner. The Kensington Avenue proposal came back with terms he could live with. He sat down with Marcus and went through it with the same rigor he brought to every contract and found nothing that alarmed him once he got past the size of the numbers. He signed in the second week of December. Marcus shook his hand and then made an expression Logan recognized as barely contained celebration. What? Logan said. Nothing, just... This is a big deal. It's a contract. It's a very large contract. I know what it is, Marcus. I'm just saying. Marcus folded the copies with excessive care. Someone should be celebrating this with you tonight. Logan looked at him. Do you want to get dinner? I meant... Marcus stopped. Sure, yeah, dinner's good. They got dinner. It was a good evening. Logan drove home afterward in a genuinely good mood, which was not the same as the manufactured version of a good mood he sometimes produced for Lily's benefit. It felt like something he'd worked toward and actually reached, which was a feeling he'd missed. He pulled into the driveway and saw the light on at the end of the lane. He sat in the truck for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to register the thing he'd been registering for a while now, without doing anything about it. That whenever he felt something worth sharing, there was a specific direction his thoughts traveled. Not to Marcus. Not to Renee. Down the lane to a lit window and a woman who returned a call about a corroded gate panel and asked good questions and made coffee for strangers at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. He took the keys from the ignition and went inside. He wasn't going to knock on her door at 9:30 on a Thursday because he'd signed a contract. That was not a reasonable thing to do, but he picked up his phone and typed, "Signed the Kensington contract today." The response came back in 4 minutes. Logan. Then, immediately after, "That's huge. Congratulations. I mean it." He looked at the message for longer than was necessary. "Thank you," he wrote. "For the name. I'm glad you said it." There was a longer pause this time. "You would have gotten there anyway," she came back. "I just moved the timing a little." He put the phone on the counter and stood in his kitchen and breathed in and out and thought about the fact that she had said exactly the right thing, not taking the credit, not deflecting the credit, just placing it where it belonged, which was somewhere between both of them, in the honest middle where things are complicated and that's okay. He went to bed and slept for 6 uninterrupted hours, which was the best he'd managed in recent memory. In the morning, Lily found a Christmas card on the front mat when she left for school, a small envelope with her name on it in the almost illegible handwriting he'd have recognized anywhere. Inside was a drawing of Biscuit wearing a Santa hat, clearly done by hand, with Happy Holidays, Lily Carter, from Biscuit and Victoria, written at the bottom. Lily held it up at the breakfast table. Dad? Yeah. Can she come to Christmas? Logan poured coffee. Outside, the December light was coming in at that flat, clear angle it sometimes had in the mornings before the cold fully settled. The lane was quiet. The oaks were bare now, just the shapes of themselves against a pale sky. That's not really something I can just... You could ask her. He looked at his daughter over the rim of his mug. She looked back at him with Dana's eyes, patient, certain, already a few steps ahead of him in a way he'd never fully gotten used to. I'll think about it, he said. Lily took a bite of her toast. Okay, she said, in a tone that suggested she had already concluded this matter in her favor. Logan drank his coffee and looked at the quiet lane and the bare oak trees and the light coming in flat and clear, and did not say anything else. But he did not put the card away when Lily went to school. He left it on the counter where he could see it, and that, in its own way, was already a kind of answer. He asked her, not about Christmas. He wasn't ready to cross that particular threshold, and the honest version of himself knew it. But the week after Lily found the card on the mat, he knocked on the iron gate at the end of the lane on a Sunday afternoon and asked if she wanted to bring Biscuit to Lily's soccer team end-of-season party at the park. It was a low-stakes invitation. A public place, a crowd of 8-year-olds, a dog who would spend the entire time being adored by children. Nothing that required him to name what he was doing. Victoria said yes without making it complicated, which he was grateful for. She showed up in jeans and a green wool pullover with Biscuit on the leash, and Lily detached from her teammates immediately upon sight and ran across the park at a speed that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this. She grabbed Victoria's free hand and began pulling her toward the snack table before Logan could intervene, narrating at full volume the entire time. Logan stood with the other parents and watched from 20 feet away. Marcus's wife Diane was next to him. Diane watched for about 4 seconds before making a quiet sound. Don't, Logan said. I didn't say anything. You made a sound. I made a neutral sound. He looked at her. She's lovely, Diane said simply, and went to refill her cup. Victoria stayed for 2 hours. She talked to the other parents without performing anything, just talked, the way she did, with the specific quality of attention that made people feel like the conversation was the only one she was interested in having. She let 3 separate children braid Biscuit's ears while he bore it with saintly resignation. When the coaches did a brief year-end acknowledgement of each player, she cheered for Lily with the same noise level as Logan, which made Lily stand 3 inches taller. On the walk back to the parking lot, with Lily running ahead and Biscuit loping alongside her, Victoria walked next to Logan in the late afternoon light. Their shoulders weren't quite touching. The distance between them had been narrowing by degrees for months, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had said so directly, which was its own kind of communication. You're good at this, Logan said. At what? Being around people, making it feel easy. She was quiet for a moment. It took a long time to learn, she said. I was not good at it. When I was younger, I was too intense, too forward. I made people uncomfortable. She glanced at him sideways. Some people. Funny, he said. Can't imagine that. She laughed, the real one, quick and unguarded. He heard it land somewhere in his chest and ignored the landing. Logan, she said. Yeah. She stopped walking. He stopped too because there wasn't another option. She was looking at him with the expression he'd been watching her manage for weeks, something direct and undecorated that she'd been too careful to say outright. I'm not going to keep pretending I'm showing up at your street for Biscuit's sake, she said. That's not fair to you. He held her gaze. I know why you're showing up. I know you know. She turned the leash once around her hand, a small, unconscious gesture. I just didn't want it to go unacknowledged forever. You don't have to do anything about it. I'm not asking you to, She stopped, and this was one of the few times he'd seen her not find the word immediately. I wanted to be honest about where I'm standing. He looked at her for a long moment. The park was behind them. Lily was 30 yards ahead, throwing sticks for Biscuit, unaware. "I'm working up to something," he said. "I'm not fast at this." "I know you're not." She said it without impatience. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded once. She nodded once. They walked the rest of the way to the parking lot in a silence that had changed shape, and he drove home with Lily asleep in the back seat 10 minutes later and sat in the parked car in his own driveway for a full minute before going inside. He was working up to something. That much was honest. January was the kind of month that tested the structural integrity of good intentions. The Kensington project started, and it started hard, permitting delays, a materials supplier who delivered the wrong load twice in a row, a crew scheduling conflict that required Logan to be on site for 60-hour stretches 2 weeks running. He dropped weight he didn't have to spare and started living on whatever Renee sent over in containers, which was usually something that required heating and came with a note that said, "Eat this." Logan in handwriting that left no room for interpretation. He texted Victoria less, not intentionally, just the days compressed until there was no margin in them, and he was aware of the silence accumulating without being able to do anything about it. She didn't push. She sent a photo of Biscuit wearing a cone of shame after a vet visit, captioned, "We're not having a great week either," and he laughed in the middle of a permit office waiting room and felt briefly human again. She left a thermos of coffee on his porch twice. No note, just the thermos, which he only recognized as hers because it was expensive and dark red, and very clearly not his. He returned the first thermos with a text that said, "Thank you." He returned the second one in person, on a Thursday evening when the worst of the project pressure had briefly eased, and she opened the door looking like she was mid-workday herself. Laptop open behind her, glasses he hadn't seen before pushed up on her head, an expression that shifted into something quieter when she saw him standing there. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you." "Come in." "I can't stay. I just wanted to return this." He held up the thermos. "And say, I know I've been absent. I haven't gone anywhere." She took the thermos and looked at him for a beat. "I know you haven't," she said. "Go sleep, Logan." "I'm fine." "You just told me you can't stay, which means you're going home to do more work, not sleep." She leaned against the doorframe. "The project will still be there tomorrow. So will the problem with the north elevation framing. Then it'll be there at 7 instead of 11. Go home." She paused. "Eat something first. There's food in that bag." She pointed to a paper bag sitting on the hall table, which he hadn't noticed, which had clearly been placed there deliberately. "I wasn't sure if you'd stop by tonight or not. I made too much anyway." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. She looked back with the even, unhurried patience that was one of the things about her he'd stopped trying to resist being grateful for. "You made too much," he said. "Constantly. It's a problem." He picked up the bag. "Thank you. Good night, Logan." He went home. He ate the food, some kind of chicken and roasted vegetables, genuinely good, and went to bed at 9:30 and slept 7 hours straight, which was the most he'd slept in 3 weeks. He woke up feeling something that was close to like himself again. He sent a text at 6:15. "That was the best I've slept in a month." Her response came an hour later. "Told you." And then, "The framing problem. What's the issue?" He almost typed, "You don't need to," and then stopped, because she was asking a real question, and she had the kind of mind that was good at problems, and she'd built her own company, and there was no reason to perform the reflexive deflection he kept producing whenever she offered something. He told her about the framing problem. She asked 3 questions he hadn't considered from quite that angle. The third one led him to call his structural engineer at 7:40 and catch an error in the original load calculation that would have created a major issue 3 months down the line. He sat on the edge of his desk and thought about that for a moment. "You just saved me a significant amount of money," he texted her. "You did the work. I just asked questions. You asked the right ones." A pause. Then, "I'm good at that." He smiled at his phone, just briefly, in the empty office, alone, and went back to work. The charity event was Victoria's idea, but it hadn't started that way. It had started as a conversation at the end of February when Lily's school sent home a newsletter about the district's single-parent resource center losing a third of its annual funding. Logan had read it over coffee and felt the particular frustration of someone who knew exactly what those resources meant. The after-school care subsidies, the emergency child care network, the tutoring programs that made the difference between a kid falling behind and staying caught up. He'd used some of them himself, early on, when he was still figuring out the shape of his life. He'd mentioned it to Victoria in passing, not with any particular intention, just the way you mention something that's sitting on your mind. She had gone quiet in a way he recognized by now as her thinking, not her disengaging. A week later, she called him. "I want to organize a fundraiser for the resource center," she said. "Serious fundraiser. Enough to cover the gap and establish an endowment. I have the connections to make it happen, but I need someone who knows what these families actually need, not what a corporate giving committee thinks they need." A brief pause. "I want you to co-lead it with me." He sat with that for a moment. Co-lead. "You'd handle the community outreach and the programming side. I'll handle the logistics and the funding. You make sure it's actually useful. I make sure it actually happens." That's a significant time commitment on top of Kensington. "I know. That's why I'm asking instead of telling." He thought about the newsletter. He thought about the early years, Lily at age 3 in a subsidized care program so Logan could get to a job site, the subsidy that kept him from having to choose between his daughter and his company. He thought about the other families in similar rooms he'd never met. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Yeah. Let's do it." He heard something shift in her voice. Not triumph, just a particular settling, like someone who'd prepared for a longer argument. "Good," she said. "I'll send you the preliminary outline." The outline arrived 20 minutes later and was 32 pages long, formatted with the precision of someone who had organized significant things before. Logan read it twice, made notes in the margins, and sent back 7 pages of responses about what was missing from the community perspective. She incorporated every point and sent a revised version within 2 days. They worked well together. He noticed this without making a particular thing of it, just the baseline awareness that their rhythms matched without effort, that they disagreed productively, that she never steamrolled him and he never deferred to her out of discomfort. The event took shape over 6 weeks, and somewhere in the middle of those weeks, without any single conversation marking the transition, Logan stopped thinking of Victoria Sinclair as the complicated neighbor and started thinking of her as someone he genuinely trusted. That was the thing that mattered most to him. Not the attraction. That had been present so long he'd mostly stopped fighting it. Trust was different. Trust was earned through 100 small moments when someone could have been different and wasn't. He'd been watching her accumulate those moments for months, and now they had a weight he couldn't dismiss. He didn't say any of this out loud, but she probably knew. She was good at reading the distance between what he said and what he meant, which was both disarming and, in its way, a relief. The event was held on a Friday evening in late March at a rented venue in uptown Charlotte. A repurposed industrial space with good acoustics and the kind of industrial modern aesthetic that worked for both corporate donors and the community families they were trying to reach. Victoria had pulled 24 sponsors. Logan had organized a panel of single parents and social workers to speak about the resource center's actual impact. Lily was there, sitting with Renee near the back, dressed in a way that suggested she'd had opinions about her outfit. The room held 230 people. Logan was near the back of the stage doing a last check on the program order when he heard a voice behind him that he didn't recognize but that landed wrong immediately, the specific frequency of someone who was performing ease rather than possessing it. "Vic, you look extraordinary, as usual." He turned. The man was in his mid-40s, expensive suit worn with the confidence of someone who'd owned many of them, dark hair, the kind of jawline that had been useful to him at some point, and he knew it. He had his hand on Victoria's arm, and she had removed it without making it obvious, which told Logan something about the dynamic before a word was exchanged about anything. "Donovan," Victoria said. Her voice was neutral in the specific way it was neutral when she was deciding how to handle something. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Thomas Aldrin invited me." He glanced around the room with a surveying quality Logan disliked immediately. "Impressive turnout. Didn't know you'd gone in for charity work." He said charity work the way some people say hobby, as though it were something you did when you'd run out of real things to do. It's important work, Victoria said. Of course it is. He turned and his eyes found Logan, and Logan watched the man's face do a specific calculation. And you are Logan Carter, Logan said. He didn't extend his hand. He wasn't sure why. Instinct, mostly. Logan co-led the event with me, Victoria said. He runs Carter Construction and knows this community better than anyone. Donovan looked at Logan with the careful blankness of someone reassessing. Construction. Right. He looked back at Victoria. So this is the project you've been devoting yourself to. I heard you'd gone domestic. The word landed in the space between them like something dropped deliberately. Victoria's expression didn't change. I moved to Charlotte. That's not domestic. That's just where I live now. Right. Donovan smiled, the kind that doesn't involve the eyes. Well, it's good of you, Vic. Very good. Helping out. He gestured loosely in Logan's general direction. Regular folks. Community outreach. Very on brand for where you are right now. Logan said nothing. He was measuring the situation the way he measured load-bearing problems, finding the structural weakness, deciding whether to address it now or wait. He was leaning toward wait when Donovan made the choice for him. I'm sure it means a lot to them, Donovan said, pitching it to the room rather than to either of them, as people do when they're performing a sentiment rather than expressing one. Having someone like you show up for a small pause, a glance at Logan, at his jacket, at whatever he was assembling from available details, ordinary circumstances, very generous of your time. The room had reached the point in the evening where conversations nearby had quieted slightly, the way they do when a particular frequency enters the space. Logan felt it without looking around. Victoria set her glass down on the table beside her. It was a very deliberate movement. Logan had seen her angry before, not often, and she didn't perform it, but there was a specific quality of stillness that preceded it. Donovan, she said, and her voice had changed register in a way that was quiet but absolute, the way a temperature changes before weather. I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it clearly. He smiled again, that same unearned smile. Of course. This event exists because Logan Carter read a school newsletter about families losing access to resources they depend on, and he was angry about it, and he did something about it. He organized a community panel. He spent 6 weeks of his evenings, on top of running a company and raising a daughter alone, making sure this room was full of people who could actually change something. She looked at Donovan with a directness Logan had seen her aim at problems she had decided to resolve. I have met a lot of men in your circles, Donovan. I have dated some of them. I have worked with most of them. And I am telling you in front of this room that Logan Carter has more character and integrity than any of them. That is not a small thing. That is the only thing that actually matters. She picked up her glass. And the word you're looking for isn't ordinary. It's exceptional. You might want to learn the difference. The silence around them was complete for 2 full seconds. Donovan's expression moved through several stages before arriving at a version of composure that didn't quite fit right. I didn't mean any offense, he said, and the sentence was the shape of an apology without the substance of one. I know you didn't, Victoria said. That's what I find most interesting about you. She turned and walked toward the stage with the even measured stride of someone who had finished that conversation entirely. Logan stood where he was for a moment. Donovan said something, a short, low word that Logan's brain registered and filed and chose to let go of, because this wasn't the time or the place, and the event had 200 people in it, including his daughter. He turned and followed Victoria toward the stage. She was standing at the edge of it, back to the room, arms crossed at her waist in the posture she adopted when she was processing something she didn't want visible on her face. Logan came and stood beside her. You okay? He said. I'm fine. A breath. I'm sorry about that. You don't need to apologize. He was here because of my world. That's on me. He was rude because of his own character. That's on him. Logan looked at the stage. Also, you didn't have to do that. She looked at him then, and her expression was the unguarded one, the one without the management layer. Yes, I did, she said. I've been watching people talk about you like you're a backdrop for months. I wasn't going to stand there. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than was strictly functional. Victoria, he said, Yeah, thank you. She nodded once and looked back at the stage. They stood there side by side in the organized noise of the room, and Logan was aware of the warmth of her standing next to him, and the 8 inches of space between them that had been 8 inches for so long, and the fact that he was tired, genuinely bone-deep tired, of treating that space like it needed to stay there. He didn't close it. Not tonight. There were 200 people in the room and a program to run and Lily watching from the back row. But he made a decision. Not an action, just a decision, the quiet internal kind that happens before anything visible. He made it the way he made structural decisions on job sites, when he'd assessed all the variables and knew what the right answer was, and stopped pretending he didn't. The event ran for 3 more hours. The keynote speaker was a woman who'd used the Resource Center's emergency care subsidy to keep her job during a custody dispute and had come back to volunteer every Saturday for the following year. She spoke for 12 minutes without notes, and the room was completely silent. They raised $420,000. It covered the gap, established the beginning of an endowment, and would be reported in the local paper the following week in a way that got the Resource Center's director a meeting with the city council. Logan drove Lily home at 10 o'clock. She fell asleep before they hit the highway, which meant he had 40 minutes of silence to sit in what had happened and what he'd decided and what came next. He didn't know exactly what came next. He never did, with things that mattered. The important stuff always had that quality, clear in direction, murky in detail. He knew the direction. He drove through the Charlotte night with his daughter sleeping in the back seat, and the city moved past the windows, and somewhere behind him on Briarwood Lane, a light was probably on in the window at the end of the lane, and Logan Carter let himself want something he hadn't let himself want in a very long time. It was terrifying. He was used to terrifying. He'd been building things in uncertain conditions his entire adult life. He could build this too. He didn't act on the decision right away. That was the honest version. He'd made it in the car driving home from the event, somewhere on the highway with Lily asleep and the city moving past the windows. And then he'd gotten home and carried Lily inside and checked the locks and sat on the couch in the dark and felt the weight of it settle onto him. Not unpleasantly, but with the specific gravity of something real. Then he waited. Not because he'd changed his mind, because he needed to be sure the decision had been made from the right place, and not from a Friday night and a charged room and a woman who had defended him in front of 200 people in a way that had moved something loose in his chest. Decisions made in the heat of feeling were not the same as decisions that survived the ordinary Tuesday morning version of your life. He knew this about himself. He'd learned it the hard way in the years after Dana, when he'd made 2 or 3 choices from the wrong place and paid for them in ways he wouldn't describe to anyone. So he waited. He watched April come in, cool and green, and the Kensington project find its rhythm, and Lily finish out the school year with the kind of energy that suggested summer was a physical thing approaching her at speed. He watched Victoria from the distance of a man who had made up his mind but not yet found the right moment to say so, and he understood that he was probably making her wait longer than was fair. She didn't show it. That was something he'd noted and was grateful for, and also something that complicated him in ways he couldn't entirely sort. A woman who showed impatience would have been easier to manage. Victoria instead simply continued to be exactly who she was, present without pressure, nearby without crowding, warm in a way that had nothing performative in it. She walked Biscuit past his house every evening. She texted occasionally, never in a pattern that demanded response. She left a book on his porch one morning, no note, a paperback on construction history he'd mentioned offhand in January that he hadn't expected her to remember. He read the whole thing in 4 days. He told her that, and she said good and didn't make anything of it. She was, he'd concluded, better at this than he was, better at the long patience of it, at holding her own feelings without either suppressing them or leading with them. It made him feel, occasionally, like a man standing in an unfamiliar structure trying to read the load-bearing walls, aware that he needed to move carefully, not because the building was fragile, but because it mattered. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening in mid-April, and it happened the way most important conversations between people who've been circling each other happen. Not planned, not staged, just the moment finding its own opening. But Lily was at a birthday party, Logan had dropped her at the Hendersons' house at 3 and had 4 hours of real quiet, which he'd used to catch up on project billing, and then, when the billing was done and he had nothing left to hide behind, he'd changed into jeans and a decent shirt without naming why and walked to the end of Briarwood Lane. She answered the gate intercom within seconds, which meant she'd been home. "Logan? Yeah, is this a bad time?" A pause. Short, not loaded. "No, come in." The gate buzzed. She met him at the front door in a cardigan and bare feet, which was a detail that struck him as unexpectedly intimate, the kind of detail that means someone has stopped performing for you and is just existing. There was music coming from somewhere inside. Something low, not jazz this time. She held the door and he came in. They ended up in the kitchen, which had become the room where they talked without ever deciding that. She made coffee without asking. He sat on the stool at the counter. Biscuit came in from the back of the house, assessed the situation, and lay down near the back door with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who has understood for months how this was going to end. "I want to talk about something," Logan said. "Okay." She handed him a cup and leaned against the counter opposite him. He looked at the coffee. He'd thought in the car that morning about how he would say this. In practice, none of those versions felt right, so he went with the plain version. "I've been afraid," he said. "Not of you. Of the thing that comes with it. Starting something with someone and it mattering." He turned the cup in his hands. "I was with Dana for 6 years. 3 of them were good years. Not perfect, but real. And then the last 2.5 were..." He stopped, started again. When you lose something like that, there's a way that grief settles into the daily architecture of your life. And after a while, you stop noticing it because it's just load-bearing. It's just part of the structure. And the idea of taking any of that weight out, he looked up at her. "It scared me. Not because I didn't want to, because wanting to meant something could go wrong again." Victoria was watching him with the still direct attention she gave to things that mattered. She wasn't filling the space. She was letting him use it. "I know what I'm doing when I walk down here," he said. "I've known for a while. I just needed to make sure I was doing it from the right place. Not just because," he searched for the word, "not because of one good night or because you're..." He stopped again. And a different version of honesty required finishing that. "You're the most interesting person I've been near in years. That's not nothing, but it's also not enough on its own." "What's the right place?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking, "knowing that I want this specific thing with you specifically, not just company, not just filling a space." He met her eyes. "I want to know you, more than I already do. I want Lily to know you. I want time to see what this is when it's not just Biscuit escaping in texts about gate hardware." He paused. "That's where I'm standing." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She set her cup down and looked at the counter, and then looked back at him. "Can I say something?" she said. "Yeah." "I don't need you to be certain," she said. "I don't need everything to be resolved before we take a single step. I'm not standing here with a plan or a timeline." She paused. "What I need is for you to stop protecting yourself from me, because I'm not the thing you're afraid of. I know you know that. I just want you to act like you know it." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Biscuit made a small sound by the door, the dream variety. "You've been patient with me," Logan said. "You've been worth being patient with. I don't know that I've earned that." "You haven't had to earn it. Logan, that's the thing about it." She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the counter. "I didn't come down this lane because you earned something. I came because I watched you carry your daughter inside when she fell asleep in the car, and you looked like a man who did that 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more without asking anyone to notice. And I noticed." She stopped. "I noticed from day one, and it never stopped meaning something to me. You don't earn that kind of attention. You were it for me, since basically the beginning." The silence after that was the kind that has weight. "I'm not easy," he said, and it came out more raw than he'd intended. I'm not good at this. I go quiet when I should talk. I overthink. I work too much. I run 3 companies and I bought a house on impulse because I drove past the lane and liked the oak trees," she said. "I have been described accurately as relentless. I have opinions about everything, and I am not always tactful about expressing them. She held his gaze. We'll figure it out. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, about all the things he'd built in his life that had started as uncertain structures. Every one of them had started with a set of unknowns, a material estimate that might be wrong, a foundation he'd tested but couldn't be fully certain of until the weight was on it. You didn't wait for certainty. You built carefully and you paid attention and you corrected as you went. He stood up from the stool and came around the counter, and Victoria straightened as he did, watching him with an expression that was open and a little careful, and he thought how strange it was that she, who had been so openly certain for so long, had her own version of this fear. Not the same, but there. He stopped close enough that the distance wasn't a distance anymore. I'm done overthinking it, he said. Good, she said quietly. He kissed her. It wasn't dramatic, and no soundtrack, no particular grace. His hand came up to her jaw, and she reached up and put her hand against his chest, and they stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon light, and the imperfect, honest reality of it was better than anything he'd constructed in his head. When they separated, she let out a breath that told him she'd been holding something for a long time. Finally, she said. He laughed, the kind that comes up without warning. Yeah, I was beginning to think I was going to have to let Biscuit escape into your yard at, professional levels of frequency. He was already at professional levels. He was at amateur levels. She looked up at him. He had a lot more in reserve. He shook his head and she smiled, and they stood in the kitchen together in the specific relief of something long anticipated finally arriving. Well, being with Victoria was not, as it turned out, simple. He hadn't expected simple. He'd built enough things to know that the structures worth having were never the easy ones. But the first months of actually being together, not circling, not adjacent, but together, had a learning curve that neither of them had been fully prepared for, and he was honest enough to say so when Renee asked how it was going. It's good, he said. It's also hard sometimes. Renee was folding laundry at his kitchen table, which she did sometimes when she came to watch Lily, because Renee considered sitting idle to be a moral failing. She didn't look up. Hard how? She lives a different life than I do. Not just the money, the rhythm of it. He leaned against the counter. She has calls at 11 at night with people in other time zones. She travels 4 days out of the month, sometimes more. Her version of a relaxed Saturday is still, he searched for it, accelerated. And your version of a relaxed Saturday is fixing your gutters. My gutters needed fixing. I know they did, Logan. Renee put down a folded shirt. You're describing two people with different speeds. That's not a problem. That's just a thing you learn to navigate. She's also... He stopped. What? She's very certain. About things. About us. She doesn't hedge. She knows what she wants and she moves toward it, and sometimes I feel like I'm still... He pressed his hands together, still checking my footing. She moved faster than you did. She's been moving faster than me since September. Renee looked at him for a moment with Dana's eyes, because they shared them, and it still caught him sometimes. Does she push you? She asked. Or does she just move? He thought about it honestly. She just moves, he said. She's never asked me to keep up. She just... He looked at the counter. She's there when I get there. She waits without making it a sacrifice. Then the problem isn't her speed, Renee said simply. The problem is you still feel like you need permission. She picked up another shirt. You don't, Logan. I'm telling you that as someone who loved Dana and loves you both. He looked at the far wall for a moment, and the familiar ache of it moved through and settled. I know, he said. Good. She snapped the shirt straight. Now go pick up your daughter. Nod. Lily, for her part, handled the change in the way children sometimes handle the things that adults find most complicated, directly and without ceremony. She'd known something was different before Logan told her anything. She was perceptive the way Dana had been perceptive, which meant she noticed the things people tried to keep at the edges. She'd mentioned Victoria's name differently, one evening in May, the week after things had changed, a small shift in tone, the sound of someone testing a new weight. Logan had heard it and sat down at the kitchen table and told her plainly that yes, he and Victoria were going to spend more time together and try something new, and that nothing about the way Logan and Lily worked was going to change because of it. Lily had listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes tracking him the way they did when she was deciding whether to believe something. "Do you like her?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I do." "Like, actually like her, or like the polite kind?" "The actual kind." She nodded slowly. "Does she know about Mom?" "She knows some things. She'll learn more over time." Lily turned her cup on the table. "I told her about Mom. At the park that time. With Biscuit." "I know. She mentioned it." "Was that okay?" "Of course it was." He reached out and put his hand over hers. "You can talk about your mom to anyone, Lily. Any time. She doesn't go away when we talk about her. That's not how it works." Lily looked at his hand on hers for a moment. Then she looked up. "Victoria's not trying to be my mom," she said. It came out as an observation, not a complaint or a wish. "No," Logan said. "She's not. She's just, more like a person who's in our life." "Yeah, that's a good way to put it." Lily thought about this with the serious, assessing quality she brought to things that mattered. "That's okay," she decided. "I like having people in our life." She picked up her cup and went back to her drawing, and Logan sat at the table for a moment longer and felt something in the long tangle of the past 4 years smooth out, just slightly, just enough to notice. The first real fight happened in June, and it was about something specific and also about something much older than the specific thing, which was how real fights usually worked. Victoria had arranged, without asking him first, for a crew from one of her commercial contacts to address a drainage problem at Logan's job site that had been causing delays. She'd mentioned it casually over dinner, presented it as something she'd taken care of, efficiently, with the confidence of someone whose version of helping was simply making problems disappear. Logan had put his fork down. "You hired people to work on my site," he said, "to address a drainage issue that was costing you. Victoria." She stopped. "That's my site," he said. "My project, my call." She looked at him. "I was trying to help." "I know you were, but you can't make decisions for my business without asking me first." His voice was level. He wasn't performing calm. He was actually working to maintain it because the instinct underneath was older and sharper than the moment warranted. "I need to be the one who manages my own operation. That's not about pride. That's about, I need to be able to trust my own judgment and have other people trust it. If you step in and solve things without telling me, you're saying I undermined you. I'm saying the intent was good and the method was wrong." She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her do what he'd seen her do in other moments, hold the initial reaction and actually think before responding. It was one of the things that made her hard to argue with and easier to trust. "You're right," she said. "I should have called you first." "Yeah. I have a habit of, She stopped and started again. "When I see a problem, I solve it. I don't always think about the fact that not every problem is mine to solve." She met his eyes. "I'll do better." "I'm not asking you to change how you think," he said. "I'm just asking you to ask me first." "That's fair." They sat with it for a moment, the kind of unresolved tension that doesn't fully dissipate in one conversation. Then she picked up her fork and looked at her plate. "I canceled the crew," she said. "Before I even told you. I realized halfway through the day that I'd overstepped." He looked at her. "You canceled them before I said anything. I was going to apologize at dinner before you brought it up. You just got there first." She glanced at him sideways. "For what it's worth, I knew I'd messed up." He exhaled through his nose. "You could have led with that." "I was trying to figure out how to say it." "You're usually pretty good with words." "I'm better with other people's problems." She turned her cup on the table, the same gesture Lily used, which he'd never noticed until that moment. "When I care about something, I get—" She searched for it. "Clumsy." He looked at her for a long moment. The edge in his chest softened. "I know the feeling," he said. They finished dinner. The conversation moved to other things, and the problem of the drainage resolved itself the following week through Logan's own contractor, and that was the end of it as a crisis. But it stayed with him as something different, as evidence that this was real, because real things had friction, and the friction between them was the honest kind that came from two people with strong selves trying to share space. They were both, he was realizing, people who had spent a long time getting very good at being self-sufficient. Unlearning the instincts of self-sufficiency was probably going to take longer than 6 months. He gave them both the grace of that. Cat. The summer moved the way summers do when you're inside something rather than watching from the outside. Faster and slower at once, marked less by calendar dates than by accumulated moments that stack into memory without announcing themselves. There was the evening in July when all three of them ended up in Victoria's kitchen during a power outage with candles and board games, and Lily beat them both at 3 consecutive rounds of cards and declared herself a professional, and Victoria's laugh that night was the most relaxed Logan had heard from her. Loose and unguarded, the kind she didn't produce for rooms or meetings or anything she was managing. There was the Saturday morning in late July when Logan found her sitting on his front steps at 7:30 when he came out for the paper. Just sitting there with 2 coffees and biscuit and an expression like she'd had a bad dream and needed a specific kind of quiet that required his particular driveway. He sat next to her and they drank coffee and didn't say much, and it was, without either of them labeling it, exactly right. There was the afternoon in August when Lily asked Victoria, with her particular combination of innocence and strategic intelligence, to help her write a letter to her mother. Not a sad letter. A letter that described the year. School, soccer, biscuit, the dad who'd started laughing more. Logan was in the garage when Lily came to get him, and he found them at the kitchen table together, Lily dictating and Victoria writing in that almost illegible handwriting, the dog asleep under the table, the afternoon light coming through the window at that August angle that makes everything look like a memory before it's finished happening. He stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't go in. Victoria looked up and found him there, and her expression was the careful one, not sure how he was landing this, wanting to read him right. He gave her a small nod that meant keep going and went back to the garage and stood there with his hands on the workbench and breathed in and out and let the feeling move through him without fighting it. It was grief, some of it. It was always going to be some of it, but beneath it and around it and growing in the space that grief had been slowly releasing was something else, not replacement. Nothing was replaced. Something additional, something that coexisted with the loss rather than canceling it. He'd been afraid of exactly this, of the specific warmth in this specific place, which was his house and his daughter and the place where Dana's presence still lived in small ways, the paint colors in the hallway, the shelving unit in Lily's room, the garden that was mostly weeds now but still carried the shape of what Dana had planted. He'd been afraid that letting someone in would mean letting Dana further out. It didn't. He understood that now. The house held both things. So did he. He went back inside. "She's going to need more paper," Victoria said without looking up. "She always needs more paper," Logan said. He sat down at the table with them, and Lily handed him the pen and pointed to a section and said, "Your handwriting is better than hers. You do this part." And Victoria protested that her handwriting was fine, and Lily said, "It looks like a doctor's handwriting. Dad's is better." And Logan took the pen and wrote the section Lily indicated, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table on a late August afternoon, and the moment was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real, and it was his. And after everything, after the long years and the loss and the learning and the careful, aching work of keeping himself intact enough to be a good father and a decent man, he was finally, honestly, here. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of this. Not of her. The lane outside was green and gold with the last of summer, and somewhere down at the end of it, through the iron gate, there was a window that had a light on in the evenings now when he walked Biscuit on nights Victoria was traveling. A light on a timer she'd set because Lily had said once that she liked the lane to look lived in. It looked lived in. He looked at it on those nights and felt the low, certain warmth of something built right. And Logan Carter, who had spent years learning to carry loss with both hands, discovered that the same hands could build with it too. September came back around the way it always did, tilting the light, cooling the mornings, returning the neighborhood to the quieter version of itself after the loose sprawl of summer. The oak trees on Briarwood Lane were beginning their slow annual release, dropping leaves in small delegations onto the sidewalk, and Logan noticed it the way he'd noticed it every year since moving here, with the particular quality of attention you give to things that mark time. A year had passed. Not exactly. It would be a year and 2 weeks, if you counted from the morning the moving trucks arrived and he'd been on his roof with a caulk gun and a cup of coffee. He hadn't been counting. But he knew it the way you know a distance you've walked before, the landmarks sitting in the right places. He was on the front porch with the last of the morning coffee when Victoria came up the front walk with Biscuit and a look on her face that meant she'd been on an early call that had not gone smoothly. She was wearing his gray sweatshirt, which had relocated to her house sometime in July, and she'd never returned, and he'd stopped pretending he wanted it back. "How bad?" he said. "The Austin property has a zoning issue I should have caught 3 months ago." She dropped onto the porch steps, and Biscuit immediately put his head on her knee. "My property manager flagged it this morning. I have a call with the city planning office at 11, and I'm already annoyed at myself." "You'll fix it." "I know I'll fix it." She rubbed Biscuit behind the ear without looking up. "That's not the point. The point is I should have caught it. Everyone misses things. I miss fewer things than this." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You're allowed to miss things. You're not actually required to be perfect." She finally looked up at him, and the expression shifted, the annoyance softening at the edges into something that still surprised him sometimes with its directness. "You're very calm about other people's mistakes." "I make too many of my own to afford the alternative." She leaned back against the porch rail and looked at the lane. The morning was clear, the kind of early September morning that still carries warmth in it even as the light has changed. "Lily's excited about 5th grade," she said. "She started a reading list. It's 14 books long." 14. She said she's being conservative. Victoria smiled at the lane. "She's going to run something someday. She's going to run everything someday. I try not to think about it." He sat on the top step beside her. Their shoulders touched. The dog settled between their feet. Down the lane, Mrs. Abernathy from number 6 was collecting her mail, and she raised a hand when she saw them, and they both raised a hand back, and that was the whole of it. Just two people on a porch on a Tuesday morning, coffee going cold, dog asleep across their feet, the neighborhood moving around them in its unhurried way. This was the thing that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the long, uncertain middle of something becoming itself. The extraordinary part wasn't the charity event, or the confrontation with Donovan, or the night he finally crossed the kitchen and kissed her. Those things mattered. But what had accumulated in the year since Victoria Sinclair moved into the house at the end of the lane was 1,000 of these small, unguarded, unheroic moments that had no particular weight individually, but stacked into something that held. He understood now why he'd been afraid of this. Not because happiness was dangerous, though he'd convinced himself of that for a while, but because the ordinary version of things, the coffee and the porch steps and the dog and the woman in his old sweatshirt, was what he'd had before. And losing it the first time had taught him that ordinary things were where the real grief lived, not in the dramatic moments, in the Tuesday mornings. He hadn't been afraid of Victoria. He'd been afraid of loving something ordinary again. He was glad he'd gotten over it. The ring had been in the drawer of his workbench for 6 weeks before he said a word about it to anyone. He'd bought it on a Saturday in late July without telling Marcus or Renee or anyone, driving 40 minutes to a jeweler that Marcus's wife Diane had mentioned once in passing as the place that didn't treat you like an account number. He told the woman behind the counter that he wasn't looking for something that announced itself. Something with weight, he'd said. Something that looked like a decision. She'd shown him a dozen rings. He'd chosen the third one he looked at and known immediately, the way he sometimes knew the right structural answer before he'd done the full math. A white gold band with a single bezel-set diamond, clean lines, the kind of ring that would wear for 50 years and still look like itself. He'd put it in the workbench drawer and gone on with his life. He wasn't sure at first what he was waiting for. The right moment, he told himself. But he'd learned enough about himself to know that waiting for the right moment was sometimes just a respectable version of being afraid. So he examined it more honestly. He wasn't afraid of asking. He was certain enough about what he wanted and what she wanted that the asking wasn't the nerve. What he was doing, he eventually understood, was waiting to feel that he'd fully closed the distance between who he'd been and who he was now. Some residual version of himself, the man from the year after Dana died, hollow in ways he'd had to rebuild slowly from the inside out, kept checking the foundations, making sure the weight would hold, He told Renee in August. She sat at his kitchen table and looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she said, Dana would have liked her. And Logan pressed his hands flat on the table and nodded and didn't say anything for a little while. And Renee let that be what it was. She would have found her hilarious, Logan said eventually. She would have. Victoria's very... Renee searched for it. Forward. That's one word. Dana liked people who said the thing. Victoria says the thing. Victoria says the thing, and then she says the thing underneath the thing. Renee smiled. Yeah. She stood and put her cup in the sink. Ask her, Logan. You're ready. You've been ready. He looked at the drawer in the workbench through the garage window. I want to do it somewhere that means something. Then find that place, Renee said simply. You'll know it when you see it. He knew it the following week. The Briarwood Lane Community Day had been a September tradition for 11 years, a block party that occupied the end of the lane and the adjacent park, with folding tables and potluck food and a stage that had been built by Logan himself 4 years ago as a volunteer weekend project. The previous year's event had been the first time Victoria had attended in her second week on the lane, bringing something she'd made and finding her way into conversations with the ease Logan had been watching since. He remembered seeing her from across the park, before he'd fully admitted to himself what was accumulating, and feeling the particular pull of someone you're trying not to look at directly. This year, she was helping Renee set up the dessert table at noon when Logan arrived with Lily, who was carrying a container of the pasta salad she'd helped make that morning, and wearing the expression of someone who had been told an important secret and was working very hard to hold it. Logan had told Lily the night before. He'd sat on the edge of her bed and told her plainly, the way he tried to tell her most things, that he was going to ask Victoria to marry him, and that he wanted Lily to know first, and that nothing she felt about it was the wrong feeling. She could be happy, or uncertain, or sad, or all three at the same time, and it would be fine. Lily had looked at him for a long moment with Dana's eyes. Are you happy? She'd asked. Not hopefully, just directly, like she needed the unperformed version. Yeah, he said. I really am. She'd nodded once, slowly, the way she did when she was filing something into the category of things that were settled. Then she'd asked if she could be there when he asked, and he'd said yes, and she'd gone back to her book with the quiet satisfaction of a child who has been included in something real. She'd done an admirable job of not telegraphing anything, which said something about her character. Though at one point during the setup she stood next to Victoria and looked up at her with an expression of such transparent fondness and nervous anticipation that Logan had had to look away before anyone noticed. The afternoon filled up the way these events did. Neighbors, food, the band that played every year, the two couples who used it as an excuse to dance in the parking lot in ways that would have embarrassed their children if their children had been paying attention. The Kensington project crew showed up, Marcus and two others. And there was a long stretch of the afternoon where Logan was in a genuine conversation about framing costs and permit timelines at a folding table, while 20 yards away Victoria was teaching Lily and two other neighborhood kids some kind of card game that seemed to involve escalating amounts of dramatic commentary. He watched her from the table. Marcus followed his gaze. You going to do it today? What? Diane told me. Before you say anything, Renee told Diane. Renee tells Diane everything. You know this. Marcus picked up his cup. So are you? Logan looked at the park, the lane, the familiar shape of the block party that had been the same every year, and felt today like the frame around something that had needed a frame. Yeah, he said. Good. Marcus finished his cup. It's about time. People keep saying that to me. People have been watching you work up to this for a year. We're invested. He slapped Logan once on the shoulder and went to find his wife. The band played a set at 4 o'clock, and the food had been demolished to its ruins, and the light was in that late afternoon position it reached on September days. Lower, more golden, giving everything the quality of a well-worn photograph. Logan found Victoria at the edge of the park near the oak trees, standing with her arms crossed and a half-full glass of lemonade, watching the band with the look she sometimes had when she wasn't managing anything. Just present and easy in her own skin, which was the version of her he'd fallen most completely for. He came up beside her. "Good party," she said. "It usually is." She leaned into him slightly, the habit of the months they'd been together. The comfortable, unconscious way bodies adjust when they've found their alignment. He put his arm around her and she settled in without breaking her attention from the band. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up at him, read his face, the way she did. He watched something come into her expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. "Okay," she said quietly. He turned to face her. He took the lemonade from her hand and set it on the table behind them, not because it mattered, but because he wanted both her hands free. He took them in his. She was watching him with absolute attention, the outside world at the edges where it belonged. "When you moved in," he said, "I was a man who had gotten very good at managing. I could manage the work and the house and being a father and being alone. I was not fine, exactly, but functional. And I'd convinced myself that functional was enough, because wanting more than that felt dangerous." He looked at her hands in his. "You disrupted all of that, not dramatically, just steadily. You kept showing up and being exactly who you are, and after a while I ran out of reasons to keep my distance." He looked up. "And the year since I stopped keeping it has been the best year I've had in a long time. Not because it's been easy. It hasn't always been easy. But because you're the kind of person who makes hard things feel worth the work, and I don't want to build the next thing without you in it." He let go of one of her hands and reached into his jacket pocket. Victoria made a sound, just one, small, involuntary, when she saw the ring box. He opened it. "I'm not going to talk for another 10 minutes about it," he said. "You know where I stand. You've known for a while." He held her gaze. "Marry me, Victoria." She looked at the ring, then at him. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was holding something back, which he'd only seen from her twice before, once at the event when the keynote speaker finished, and once on the August afternoon at the kitchen table with Lily's letter. "Yes," she said, not embellished, just the word, clean and whole. The way she said things she meant completely. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He'd gotten the size from Diane, who had gotten it from Renee, who had apparently measured one of Victoria's rings while she wasn't looking, which was a conspiracy he intended to thank all parties for later. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her in the September light, and behind them the band was playing something unhurried, and the lane was full of the people who had been the ordinary texture of his life for years. Lily appeared from somewhere to his left at a speed that suggested she had been watching from a strategic position. She wrapped her arms around both of them simultaneously. "I knew before anyone," she announced into the middle of the hug. "I told you first on purpose," Logan said. "I know. That's why it counts more." She pulled back and looked at Victoria with a very serious expression. "Does this mean Biscuit can come over whenever?" Victoria laughed. The unguarded kind. "Biscuit already comes over whenever. But now it's official." "Sure," Victoria said. "It's official. Biscuit has full access." Lily considered this satisfactory. She went back to the party with the energy of someone who has accomplished a mission. Logan and Victoria stood in the relative quiet the moment left behind. "She negotiated dog rights at your proposal," Victoria said. "Did you expect anything different?" "No." She looked at the ring again, the habit of the newly engaged. "She's perfect. She's a menace." "I know, that's what I said." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What do we do now?" "Now we go eat whatever's left of the dessert table and tell everyone who doesn't already know." "Marcus knows." "Marcus has known for a month, Diane told him." "How does Diane know?" "Renee told Diane." She shook her head slowly. "Your neighborhood has a better intelligence network than my entire legal team." "It's a talent." He took her hand and they turned back toward the park, toward the familiar noise of it, toward Marcus already raising a cup in their direction from across the lawn, with an expression of entirely unsurprised satisfaction. The months that followed were not a seamless unfolding. They fought twice in October. Once about the renovation timeline for the house they'd decided Logan and Lily would eventually move into with Victoria, and once about something smaller and stupider that was actually about the larger fear underneath the smaller thing, which they were both self-aware enough to recognize and say out loud once the actual argument had burned itself out. They sat on opposite ends of the couch and worked through it the way they'd learned. Not cleanly, not without tension, but honestly and to completion. Victoria's Austin property issue cost more to resolve than expected. Logan's Kensington project hit a 3-week weather delay in November that pushed the schedule and required a difficult conversation with the developer. Lily went through a stretch in the fall where school was hard in a social way that was invisible to adults until it wasn't. And Logan and Victoria navigated it together. Logan handling the direct parenting, Victoria providing a specific kind of companionship to Lily that was different from a parent's, and for that reason, sometimes more accessible. They were not always graceful about the division of it. There was a night in November when Logan came home late from a site issue and Victoria had fallen asleep on the couch, waiting up for him, her laptop open, biscuit on her feet, the television running something she wasn't watching. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the picture of it. His house, which had been so empty and so quiet for so many years, full now in the ordinary way that ordinary things fill spaces. The specific warmth of another person's life woven into the furniture. He closed the laptop and turned off the television and sat in the chair across from her and let the quiet settle. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. He was just there. She woke up about 20 minutes later, blinked at him, and said, "How long have you been sitting there?" "A while." "Why didn't you wake me?" "You look comfortable." She sat up and pushed her hair back. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything's good. Go back to sleep." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that meant she was reading past the surface. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. She lay back down and pulled the blanket up and said, "Come to bed when you're ready," and closed her eyes. He sat for a while longer. There was nothing dramatic in the room. Just the dog breathing and the quiet house and the dark outside the windows and the ring on her hand visible where her arm rested over the edge of the couch. Just the evidence of a life that had managed to keep going and build into something he hadn't been able to imagine from inside the hardest years. He thought about Dana. He thought about the way grief never fully vacated but changed shape over time, from the sharp, acute kind into something slower and rounder that you carried differently. Not gone, not diminished, but integrated. Part of the structure rather than a wound in it. He'd learned to live with that the way he'd learned to live with a lot of things, not by resolving it, but by making enough room for everything to coexist. He thought about Lily asleep down the hall, and Victoria asleep on the couch, and the lane outside the window where the oak trees were bare now, just their honest shapes, nothing to recommend them except that they were exactly what they were, which was enough, which had always been enough. He thought about what it cost to stay open to things. The real cost, not the performance of it, the actual daily decision to keep your hands unclenched, to keep moving toward the people you've chosen, to not let the worst things that happened become the story you told yourself about what was still possible. It cost something real. He wouldn't minimize that. There were nights in the years after Dana when he'd been so depleted that the idea of ever wanting anything again had felt not just impossible but vaguely obscene, like aspiring to something he hadn't earned the right to anymore. Those nights had been real. He hadn't gotten through them by being strong. He'd gotten through them by being persistent, by just doing the next small thing and the one after that and trusting that persistence, even without hope, was a form of forward motion. And it had been. Slowly, without announcing itself, it had been. This was the thing he would want to tell anyone who was standing in the middle of that particular long night. Not that it gets better in any clean or linear way, and not that time heals things. Time doesn't heal things, people do, by choosing to keep building even when they're not sure what they're building toward, by letting the right people stay, by accepting that grief and love and fear and hope are not opposites but occupants, all of them sharing the same space. And the goal is not to evict any of them, but to learn how to live with the whole complicated household of yourself. Victoria had not saved him. He wanted to be clear about that, even in the private accounting. He'd saved himself, but incrementally, imperfectly, over years. And then she had come down the lane with a plate of brownies and a golden retriever and the specific stubborn warmth of someone who had decided to know him. And he had been, finally, in a condition to let her. That was the love story, not the finding, the being ready to be found. They were married this following September on a Saturday in the yard of the house on Briarwood Lane. Not the mansion, his house. His yard with the oak trees and the repaired fence and the garden that Lily had redesigned in the spring with opinions she'd gotten mostly from a library book. Victoria had suggested it without any apparent concern for square footage or catering logistics, and Logan had looked at her when she said it and felt the quality of knowing someone so well that their choices stopped surprising you and started sounding like themselves. The yard held 40 people. Marcus was the best man. Renee cried before the ceremony started and told Lily she wasn't crying, and Lily told her it was okay to cry, and Renee said, "I know it's okay, I know," and hugged her. Biscuit wore a bow tie that lasted approximately 11 minutes before he sat on it, which was 9 minutes longer than Logan had predicted. Lily walked her father down the makeshift aisle between the folding chairs, which had been her specific request. She held his arm with both hands, very formally, and her chin was up. And Logan looked at her and thought about the morning she was born and the night Dana died and the years between that and this, all of it converging in the 20 feet of September grass between the house and the woman waiting at the end of it. Victoria was in ivory, a simple dress with clean lines, her hair down, no veil. She looked like herself, which was the best version of beautiful that Logan knew how to recognize. She watched him walk toward her with an expression he'd never quite seen from her before. Not the managed version, not the direct version, just her, with everything down. They'd written their own vows. His were short because he'd learned by now that the things that mattered most were usually the shortest to say correctly. He told her he'd spent years building things that stood up under weight, and that she was the first thing he'd let himself build that he couldn't measure in advance, and that it had been worth every uncertain moment. He told her that she'd taught him, without trying to, by just being exactly who she was, that the parts of himself he'd thought he needed to protect were actually the parts that needed to breathe. He told her he was glad she'd come down the lane. She told him that she had bought the house at the end of Briarwood Lane because she drove past it on a Tuesday afternoon and something she couldn't name made her stop the car and look. She thought it was the property. She knew now it wasn't. She told him she had been relentless about most things in her life, and it had served her, but that patience had been the hardest thing she'd ever practiced. And she had practiced it for him specifically, and she would practice it again and again because some things were worth the slowness of. She told him she loved his daughter like her own without trying to replace a single thing, and that she intended to still be arguing with him about paint colors when they were both old enough to know better. Lily laughed at that, and the crowd laughed with her, and Victoria looked at Logan and raised an eyebrow that meant still true though, and he shook his head and smiled and took her hands. The ceremony was 22 minutes. The party afterward was 4 hours and ran into the dark with lanterns strung between the oak trees, which Lily and Marcus's youngest had hung on a stepladder with varying degrees of straight, and the irregularity of it was exactly right. At some point late in the evening, Logan found himself standing at the edge of the yard with Marcus, both of them with drinks, and the particular quiet of two men who have known each other long enough that silence is a form of conversation. The party was behind them. The lane was dark and familiar in front. "Good day," Marcus said. "Yeah," Logan said. "You look like a man who's actually here." Logan thought about what that meant and knew exactly what it meant. "Yeah," he said again. "I am." Marcus nodded once, satisfied, and they stood for a moment longer watching the lane and the dark trees, and then Marcus said he was going to get more of whatever that cake was, and went back to the party. Logan stood alone for a minute. The neighborhood was quiet around the noise of his own yard. The street was the same street it had always been. The same sidewalk, the same oak trees, the same houses with their lit windows. He'd walked this lane 1,000 times, in rain and sun, and every season, most of them in the years when he walked it alone. When the walk was just the physical fact of getting from one end to the other without anything particular waiting at either end. Now at the far end of it, the iron gate stood open. Had been open all day, the way Victoria kept it more often than not now, which the neighbors had stopped remarking on. And behind him, the yard was full of people and noise and his daughter's laugh and his wife's voice carrying over everything, directing something, her natural state, the thing he would listen to every day for the rest of his life and never once find ordinary. He went back. Lily found him near the dessert table at 10 o'clock and took his hand, the way she'd done since she was small enough to need the height. She didn't say anything. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him with an expression that was old for her age, the particular oldness that children develop when they've understood early that the world can take things away, and have chosen anyway to love it. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "Are you?" "I'm really good, Lily." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned into his side, and they stood at the edge of their own party and watched the lantern light move in the oak trees, inconsistent and warm, exactly the way it had been strung. Here's what Logan Carter understood, standing in his yard on the night of his wedding with his daughter's hand in his, and the evidence of everything he'd built visible in every direction. That loss doesn't end you, that it changes the shape of you, sometimes permanently, and you learn to carry the new shape until it becomes familiar. That the people who stay, who choose you in the ordinary dailiness of it, not just in the moments that require heroism, are the ones worth every hard conversation and every Tuesday morning that asks nothing of you but your presence. That love is not, in the end, a feeling you fall into. It is a series of decisions you make in ordinary circumstances, repeated until they accumulate into a life. That Briarwood Lane looked different to him than it had 14 months ago, not because it had changed, because he had, slowly and imperfectly and without a straight line from there to here. Because grief, if you survive it and keep moving, eventually creates space instead of just taking it. And into that space, if you're willing, if you're finally honestly willing, something real can come. Victoria came and found him just before 11, slipping her hand into his free one, and the three of them stood there a moment, her, him, Lily, in the lantern light of the yard with the lane beyond the fence and the dark sky above the oak trees and the sound of people who loved them. "Ready to go in?" Victoria said. "Not quite yet," Logan said. She leaned against him, and they stayed a little longer in the honest, ordinary light of the life they'd built. And it held, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. It was everything.